We're seeing the changes that's going on globally.
Our context has shifted a bit even this week.
With the rapid changes of the world, we have to adapt so quickly.
The change was really quick. For RMIT, it was literally overnight.
I'd like to welcome our friends in Spain, Vietnam, Melbourne, and all around the world to this next forum. What a truly global call this is.
The kinds of questions
that are of strategic importance to this institution
that really go to the heart of what a university is, what its purpose is, how it plays in our broader social and economic environment, and who it's for.
Graduated RMIT student.
Bachelor of Fashion Design.
I'm proud you're a woman.
Some of them from inside the university.
Wow, it's a big question.
Some of them from outside the university.
We want to get the voice of the external world.
I'm in year 11, so still in high school.
Thank you for contributing to our strategy, which is exactly what this needs to look like.
Education to me is how do we sustain one another as a people.
As industry acting as educators, educators acting as problem solvers.
An organisation that is reflecting and putting that into action.
It's important for RMIT to really bring out the genius in their students.
We're here for something called RMIT Next.
RMIT Next.
All about RMIT Next.
And for those of you who don't know, RMIT Next is our community co-development program.
The next stages of our strategy work
to shape the university's future across our global community.
Let's go big or go home. Tom, there's your answer. We're going big, mate.
That's a big question. I mean, I'm so impressed by the quality of the discussion today.
In my opinion, it's not just academic, it's experience-based as well.
Looks like the conversations have been really vibrant on the community website.
I'm really optimistic.
We're all kind of part of the extended ecosystem.
Already doing stellar effort. Of course, we can always go further.
It's a great kind of joining together of the whole extended community that will focus where RMIT goes from here and create RMIT's next strategic chapter.
Hello everybody, I'm Martin Bean and I'd love to welcome you to the session today. I'm going to be host for you. I'm the very proud Vice Chancellor of RMIT and it's going to be a wonderful hour that we're spending together to help inform our next strategy. So Wominjika, welcome everybody to today's forum and to all of you from the RMIT community who've joined us from throughout the world. As is my custom and the university's custom, I'd like to start by today recognizing that I'm standing on the unceded lands of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation. And I'd like to respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past and present, and the traditional custodians and their ancestors on the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. Education is embedded in Indigenous communities, and it always has been. Hands-on and woven through the stories that pass down through generations. This holistic, relationship-driven experiential learning goes to the heart of what I believe is the best kind of education, and it begins with community. And that's exactly what today is all about. Developed together with the Asia Society Australia, and thank you so much for your support, the intent of this session is to access our community to explore the insights and expertise of international thought leaders on one big question. And that question is, how can a global university drive impact in a rapidly changing world? It's a question that a lot of innovative and creative minds are focused on at RMIT right now, but also in nations, schools, universities, and colleges throughout the world in curated opportunities exactly like this one. RMIT is a university built for the real world. We'd like to think that we adapt, we change, and we respond to the environment of the day. And to do that properly, it's really important that we take the time to listen. And I can't wait to hear all of the panelists and what they've got to say, but also through your questions, what's on your mind and the sorts of things that you want to discuss as well. So let me kick off by introducing our guests. And I'm going to make a little bit of an assumption that you've had a chance to read the information about the panelists. So I won't spend too much time going through their incredibly impressive credentials, but I would like to just say a few words about them before we get going. Kat Tao Nguyen, wonderful to see you, Tao. It's been way too long since we had a chance to be in a session like this together. Is Managing Director of Global Ready LLC, an inclusion strategist and co-founder and chair of the Australian Vietnam Leadership Dialogue, or what often gets referred to as the AVLLD. A very big welcome and thank you for being here, Tao. Pre-COVID, I had the good fortune of meeting with Tao in Vietnam. And one of the things I realized right away was that we both share a passion for inclusive leadership, diversity, and a commitment to elevating the lives of young people everywhere. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to read it yet, I really commend to you Tao's award-winning book, We Are Here, about her family's migration to Australia. It's just a wonderful book, and I commend it to you. Colin, welcome to you as well. It's great to have you here from Singapore. Colin is head of Google for Education, Japan, and Asia Pacific, and as part of at Google Cloud. And Colin, it's terrific to have you with us. As I mentioned, coming live to us today from Singapore, and I believe your focus is very much on the enormous power of technology to make education a right and not a privilege, something that I've spent my entire career fighting for. So I'm sure we have a lot in common. And finally, Richard Maud, the Executive Director of Policy at the Asia Society Australia and a Senior Fellow with the Asia Society Policy Institute. Thanks for being with us as well, Richard. Richard joined the Asia Society Australia in January 2020 at the highest level and brings foreign policy expertise and deep knowledge of national security matters to our region. Richard, among his many career highlights, was Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to former Prime Minister Gillard, a role that I'm sure was incredible given how inspiring our former Prime Minister Gillard is, Richard. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for giving so generously of your time today. To our audience that are tuning in, I'm going to leave time for your questions at the end. So can I please ask that as we go through each of the questions that I'm about to ask, please go ahead in the YouTube chat function and put your questions in there. And if you can do me a favor as the moderator, see if you can just tell me who you'd like your question directed through to, so that we can get through as many of the questions that you've got today as possible. That would be super. So I'm going to focus sort of on an introductory question for our panelists. And that is, as we look to the future of a rapidly changing global landscape, what are the big themes shaping the world, and how are these themes impacting the mood across the Asia Pacific region? And Richard, if it's okay, I'm going to come to you first. As a foreign policy expert, well versed in geopolitics and strategic issues of the region, I would really love to know what you believe the answer to that question is, the big themes shaping the world and how they're impacting on the Asia Pacific region. So over to you, Richard.
Well, thanks very much, Martin, and thank you to you and all your colleagues at RMIT for inviting me along today. It's really terrific to be here, and looking forward to a conversation and also to hearing from my fellow panelists. Look, it's a really big question, but I think the short answer is that the world, as we knew it for much of the post-Cold War period, has been unraveling. I think that's probably a pretty fair description for a while now. And that change is accelerating now with multiple factors driving change. And that really does add up to a very turbulent and challenging environment for Australia at the moment. Prime Minister Morrison gave a speech last year, and he summed all this change up by describing Australia's external environment as becoming poorer, more dangerous, and more disorderly. It's not a very cheery, quote, but it has the benefit of being honest. There's a lot we could talk about here, but given that I want to try and be brief and that we've got a lot to get through, I just want to mention three really big drivers of change. First one, is an obvious one, and that's China's rise and rise. China that's wealthier, it's more powerful, it's more assertive, it's more nationalist, and we're seeing a greater clash of interests and values between China and many other countries in the world. And it's clear in particular that we're in for a sustained period of tense and tough, full spectrum US-China competition, by which I mean political, economic, technological, and ideological. And I think, navigating the China relationship and that competition is really the great foreign policy challenge of the age for Australia. And it's not one that just engages governments, it also engages businesses, and of course it absolutely engages universities, as you all know, Martin, much better than I. And what it means is that there are high levels of risk and uncertainty for all of us. That's here to stay, I think, and that the policy choices are harder, and there are real trade-offs in making those decisions. The second big trend I want to mention is a rework of globalisation. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking here about a great unwinding of globalisation. There'll still be plenty of cross-border trade and interaction, and hopefully one day we'll all get back to flying around the world and so on. But there's definitely change afoot, and that's going to drive some pretty profound, I think, adjustments in the way in which globalisation, particularly global manufacturing and trade, works. But also, I think this is really important for universities, the exchange of ideas and expertise. And the factors driving this are many and complex, and I can't do justice to them here, but just at the headline level, they include things like the further automation of manufacturing. They include the pandemic's effect on the way governments and businesses think about supply chain resilience and risk. They include US attempts to bring more manufacturing jobs back home. And I think really importantly too, what we're seeing now is a strong desire by the United States and some of its partners like Australia to end their dependence on China for some critical technologies and materials. So I'm talking here things like semiconductors, batteries, critical minerals, and so on. And I think interestingly, China now is also equally anxious not to be dependent on the United States. It sees that as a vulnerability. So it's inevitable we're going to see more of this technological decoupling or bifurcation between the United States and China. And that's not just going to be about widgets and gadgets. It's going to extend, as it already has, to research and scientific collaboration. And the third and last of these trends I wanted to mention is the pandemic itself and its economic effects. And I think there's a really long bow wave here with implications for debt across the world, inequality. We've seen a big jump in global poverty for the first time in decades. And although Asia's bouncing back faster than others by and large, it's going to take some countries years or maybe longer to recover the GDP that they've lost. And they're going to struggle for quite some time with unemployment, the lost human capital, increases in inequality and risk to social cohesion. Martin, I'm going to stop there. I haven't even mentioned climate change. I haven't mentioned the global democratic recession. I haven't mentioned much about tech. But in the interest of sort of keeping it tight, I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Richard. I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunity to jump in later. Richard, would you agree with me? In my lifetime, I've never felt a time where government-to-government dialogue and the stress of strain of government to government had such an impact on my ability to have citizen-to-citizen dialogue in industry or in a university or whatever. It seems to me that these forces coming together have gone deeper into the dialogues between nations in our societies than I can remember in my lifetime. Does it feel that way to you?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does, and part of the reason is that the pace of change that your excellent promo really captured very well. I mean, we all forget our history, of course. Change is a constant, and there have been other periods in Australia's history of dramatic and very profound and significant change. But I do really think there's something a bit different about the current era because there's so much going on at once, so many big forces driving change. And in particular, we're in what's going to be a very long-term process of working out how we coexist with China. And that's throwing up some very profound policy dilemmas for government. But because of the particular nature of some of these challenges, they are really now being felt by business and by institutions in society and university, and by large parts of our community, including, of course, our Chinese communities in Australia, who really themselves do feel the press of this competition and the sort of the very polarized debate that we have now in Australia on many of these issues.
Yeah, no, thank you. Colin, coming to you next. So you and I have both spent a big part of our working lives looking at the intersection of education and technology. And so what's your take on the way some of these global trends are having an impact on the region from an ed tech sort of perspective?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks everyone for having me here. It's really my pleasure, and it was really interesting to hear from the other panelists. Rich, that was really interesting way of capturing a lot of very big trends. I guess from my perspective and some of the things that we're seeing, I would focus in on some of the transformation that we're seeing in terms of the impact on business, on education, and really government during this period of sort of working and studying from home. And we're seeing some, I guess, broad-based transformation in some of these structures, sort of on a human level. So on a individual level, how people are interacting on a day-to-day basis. In a lot of ways, obviously COVID has kind of accelerated a shift that was already underway. And sometimes that's organically at the individual or sort of grassroots level. And sometimes it's at larger scale and sort of policy. I guess from an education angle, we see a lot of transformation happening across the different APAC countries. An example of sort of that policy level change was something that's been happening in Japan. Japan had a 4 to 5 year plan to start introducing technology into the classroom. And sort of recent events with COVID, they basically accelerated that into a 9-month program, something called the GIGA program, which was remarkable. So, people who are familiar with the Japanese government, some of the other governments in the region, this type of large-scale change typically takes many years of planning, many years of execution, but we've seen a shift that, frankly, we've never seen before. So in this case, basically, Japanese education was going from very traditional environment. So literally, if you talked about K through 12, to some extent higher ed as well, you're talking about, chalkboards in the classroom, everyone sitting there in uniform, fax machines as a primary mode of communication in the office, moving to within 9 months, effectively a place where every student in primary and middle school in Japan now has their own laptop. And, hundreds of thousands of teachers being trained up and being given the confidence to start introducing technology into the classroom, whether it's distance learning or in the physical classroom. So it's been pretty rapid to see this type of change. At the grassroots level, we've seen, massive shifts in terms of obviously what's been happening in distance education, distance work. One of our platforms called Google Classroom, we saw it jump, monthly active users jump, I think between February and April of last year from like 50 million to 100 million. And then since then it's grown by another 50 million. And you see similar stats for Meet, for Zoom, where just, you've seen this just total transformation in how education is happening.
It's really, really extraordinary. Carry on.
So we're seeing that happen. We're seeing a lot of grassroots innovation as well happening across the APAC market. So whether that's in Vietnam or in India, you look in a lot of both the ed tech space as well as the space around sort of working associated with working from home, and you're just seeing significant activity in terms of new products, in terms of innovation that's happening in terms of investment as well. So you see a lot of M&A activity as well. So you're seeing a lot of these things that were underlying trends happening just really accelerated. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out as we come out of this period. But early indicators, when we look at whether it's Australia, we look at Korea, we look at some of the countries that have, temporarily sometimes, and sometimes completely sort of move past a certain period, we see some indicators of what the future is also going to look like from a in-person versus distance, and some of the technology and engagement pieces that are happening. But It's a really interesting time.
It is. And one of the things I'll get you to comment on later is, what your personal prediction would be as to whether these new ways of hybridized learning, leveraging technology as well as the physical, are here to stay forever, or whether you think if we get on top of the virus sooner rather than later, whether people will revert and go back to their old ways. So have a think about that for me, and I'll be back to you in a couple of minutes to ask you about that. Tao, is an inclusion strategist based in Vietnam. You'll have a different perspective from Singapore and Australia. What's your sense of these global trends and the impact on the region?
Thanks, Martin, and thanks for this fantastic opportunity to be part of this amazing event. I actually would agree with Colin, his statement that there are these underlying trends that are already happening pre-COVID, and I think that COVID has actually accentuated some of these trends and major themes. So I would categorize some of the themes in three areas: ecological, social, and spiritual. And I would sort of refer to spiritual more about, a purpose, and asking those questions of, especially young people asking, where is my place within society, within my region, within the world? How do I make an impact? So I work across the Asia Pacific region with senior leadership teams and CEOs. So I also work across, Japan, China, Australia, Singapore, etc. And, what I think is happening, some of the themes, is that there is a questioning of traditional models, things that we have taken for granted, especially in the developed West. So this idea of, the profit motive in capitalism, the idea of individualism being, and liberalism being, the great paradigm. And so, you see collectivist countries like Vietnam doing incredibly well in COVID. Our numbers are incredible. And so I think there is a real, questioning of what we've taken for granted in terms of political and economic structures. And then in terms of, the ecological themes, I think that there is a growing consciousness about, climate change, about, and Richard, you did mention that, but, about, what is happening in terms of environmental devastation and destruction, and how have we and our systems, our traditional systems, have perpetuated this. And as I work with senior leadership teams, this question of climate change isn't just in the realm of green groups and NGOs and so forth. It is a strategic risk for business. Can they get insurance in terms of shipping, in terms of their supply chain that is climate related. Right, so it's actually now really at the fore of what governance means, right? So there's this sort of growing consciousness. The other thing, and also, consumer sentiment driving a growing consciousness in our ecological, issues. And then, obviously the great themes that have emerged in the last couple of years is social, Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter, gender equality. There's a massive erosion of trust in our traditional institutions, from banks to governments, So I think what has traditionally been in the realm in terms of social justice of governments and NGOs is now being completely mainstreamed into the private sector, into business, and into all aspects of society. And I think that, COVID, whilst Colin's point, it's accelerated, the uptake of innovation and technology. I think it's also made inequality in some respects very heightened. The access to technology isn't actually, broad and fair. And so and also women, a lot of the jobs that have been lost have been actually, taken up by a lot of women. And so what I'm actually seeing, whilst the Asia Pacific is incredibly diverse, what I'm actually seeing is that there is a convergence. There is a convergence of social issues, of things that boards of private sector everywhere are considering as strategic risks. And I think that convergence is possibly a benefit for a common ground for conversation for us to actually accelerate on these issues. And the last thing I want to touch on is this sort of idea of, I call it spiritual, but I think, as individuals, due to COVID, but also possibly before that, and especially with young people, there is this sort of a return to fundamental questions. How do I derive meaning in my life? What is the work that I'm doing actually creating impact and contentment and fulfillment? And I think those questions from an individual level, as we all work from home, and then all of our countries are emerging out of that in different stages, I think that is a great opportunity for us to sort of look at these realignment questions on an individual, an organisation, and a more macro level. Was it something I said?
Yeah.
Okay, we've lost Martin.
Maybe I'll jump in, Tal. Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
I'm Leighton. There must just be a slight tech hiccup there, but I just want to come back to one point that you made, Tal, and just deep dive a little bit further on this. And this is really about the mindset of young leaders right now in the region. And perhaps if you could just say in a little bit more detail as a follow-up question, what do you think we at RMIT could do to set our students up to be future leaders in Asia?
Great question, and I think that's absolutely connected to the role of universities, right? So I think young people now are in a very different landscape to when traditional education institutions have been set up, right? And so they're in an information age, they're in an age where they're very nimble, and I think that what RMIT and all education organisations can do is go back to the root word of education, right? So the Latin root word of education is educare, which means to draw out, right? And it's actually not knowledge transfer. It's actually this idea, and I think it was mentioned in the video at the beginning, is to bring out the genius within the students. So an idea that we facilitate, we enable and draw out their potential for wisdom and potential for intelligence so that they can be of service to create a more sustainable planet, a more sustainable way of living and being and doing business and what have you. So I think that, what young leaders and young people now, especially in the Asia Pacific region, are an incredibly diverse region. You've got a very big scale of development, but a real convergence, as I said before, of young people, questioning whether they perpetuate the unequal systems that they're in, or they can play a different role. And I think that, in the startup land, you see a lot of young people trying to actually create businesses, social enterprise type of businesses. You see the emergence of impact investment funds, funds focused just on gender, for example, or the masses and the rising lower income classes. So I think, you know, the social issues that are being brought forward is something in the consciousness of young people, and universities can play that absolute enabler role as a convener of different stakeholders that come into the lives of these young people, so that their potential can, for their existing wisdom to emerge, can actually be crystallized. And so I think it's an incredibly exciting time for universities at the moment. And really, you know, we don't know all the answers. You know, it is as Richard said, it is a time of immense change. But what we can do is not have the answers, but actually create the conditions for the answers to emerge through our students and our young people.
Thank you, Tao. Can you hear me again now, Tao? Excellent.
Absolutely.
So I'm back.
Thank you.
But Bean is back, so that's very good. Hey, Colin, I'm coming back to you on that question that I put before. I spent probably the first 20 years of my time in ed tech wrestling with people who tried to define education as either online or face-to-face. And then one of the accelerants of COVID is it's thrown all of our lives into this hybrid space. So what's your prediction, Colin? What do you think is going to happen post-COVID? Are we going to stick with it, or are people going to head back into their comfort zones?
Yeah, and I think it's a good question. I think the reality is a bit of both, right? So what we've seen is, you know, clearly this period has sort of accelerated a lot of change. But I think as we move back, we'll take some of that change, some of the use of technology, some elements of distance learning and technology, both outside the classroom and inside the classroom. And this will be the same thing, I think, for the workplace. But it really will be more of a sustained hybrid model, I think. You know, and in different countries and different environments, it's going to be a bit diverse. You know, when I think about it, I think a lot about how sort of I've personally observed both in the classroom as well as during this period of sort of distance learning and working with teachers and boards of education, ministries of education, and sort of higher ed institutions. And I think one of the things that I see is that when we talk about sort of innovation, we often think about sort of big tech companies. We think about, you know, ed tech startups. But a lot of the innovation that happens, and to some extent, maybe this goes back to what Tao was speaking about a moment ago, is sort of micro level innovation by professors, by teachers, by students, both in the sort of physical classroom as well as sort of online classroom. So we're seeing that the way that teaching and learning is happening is evolving, right? And some of that is sort of in a physical space, some of that is sort of online. But I think, you know, we've seen a lot of different models that are starting to emerge. You know, we're seeing micro credentials. We're seeing lots of online short courses around specific skill sets. We're seeing also a lot of innovation in terms of the way that engagement happens and the way that engagement happens between students, between teachers. And we're seeing this both in the physical environment as well as in the digital environment. So, for example, in the physical environment, even, you know, pre-COVID, I think the last trip I was on was sort of January before it started. I remember being in Finland and seeing a classroom. I think it was sort of high school level, or maybe a little bit earlier, maybe middle school. And basically what they had started moving to was having large classrooms, about 75 or 80 students in a classroom, each with their own devices that are sitting in groups that shift from day to day, and I think subject matter, and multiple teachers teaching. So this is kind of a combination of physical in-person and online learning that was happening. And it was a way where they'd identified basically when you have individual teachers teaching on their own, they don't get the kind of cross coaching and learning. And similarly, what they found was that students being able to have these shifting groups allowed them to also learn from each other and learn in sort of more effective ways. So that type of sort of rethinking of sort of the education model, I think, has been happening and has been accelerated a bit. And so I think in the coming year, 2 years, we're really going to see a lot of that start playing out. And that evolution will continue for the next 5 to 10 years. So that's sort of a long answer to your question about Whether it's going to go back to the original, I don't think so. Is it going to stay 100% online? Also, I don't think so. But there's going to be continued and sort of more rapid evolution in the combination of the two.
Yeah, no, thank you. And we see it playing out in the use of physical spaces for work as well in parallel, which we're all experiencing as well, where the whole notion of a workplace has been redefined as well, as it sort of has disrupted every element of our lives. Tao, I must tell you though, one of the silver linings for me in being in isolation in my home were my lunchtime conversations with my 2 teenage daughters, where we all started discussing new meaning in our lives, what we were appreciating, what we weren't, what we'd lost, what we were worried that we wouldn't get back, what we hoped we wouldn't get back. I think you're right. I think this notion of a resetting of what meaning is at an individual, a family, a community, and also a society or a national level, it's a pretty profound time, which, Richard, brings me back to you, because obviously there isn't a nation in the region that isn't a little bit concerned as they watch the United States and China sort of position themselves in the new world order. And I'm wondering if you touched on it a bit in your preamble, but can you maybe spend a little bit more time thinking about what should we be thinking about as a university, or what should our citizens be thinking about, as literally we're seeing one of those big shifts in sort of geopolitics and power? What do you think we should be taking into consideration, Richard?
Well, look, in relation to Southeast Asia, you blanked out a bit, but I think that's where you were going in your question. I do think there are a couple of factors that are really opening up opportunities for Australia if we're active and determined enough to seize them. And one is the point that you finished on. So, just about everyone in the world, but certainly in Southeast Asia, is feeling the challenge of dealing with a much more powerful China and of navigating US-China competition. And look, this is not to say that Southeast Asian countries think about China exactly the same way as they do about Australia, but I do think in their own way they're interested in hedging, and a big part of that is diversifying their relationships. So they're looking for options. They want more than one partner that they can turn to, whether that's for foreign investment or whether it's for trade or security cooperation or development assistance or indeed for education and training. And I think that's quite a strong dynamic. I've talked about this degree of convergence between Australia and Southeast Asia because of that factor. You can really see this dynamic at work in our relationship with Vietnam. That's probably where you see it most strongly, but you can see it right across Southeast Asia to greater or lesser extents. And then I think the second big factor is the pandemic. And, I touched very briefly on the fact that most of the economies in Southeast Asia are going to bounce back this year. But many are going to struggle with the pandemic for quite some time. In Indonesia and the Philippines, for example, the pandemic is still not under control. Vaccine rollouts are very much a work in progress. It could take years in Indonesia to, get most of the population vaccinated. The economic hit was very heavy. The impact was not evenly distributed. And in Southeast Asia, we see, what the IMF and the World Bank, they sort of talk about divergent recovery paths. So if you're an economy that was very heavily reliant on services like tourism or hospitality, or if you were a region or a business, obviously you've been hit disproportionately hard, much harder than if you're an economy that is driven by manufacturing. And that means that the effect on people, on individuals, is also divergent. And if you're a worker in the hospitality or tourism sector, or in the very big informal sector in Southeast Asia, then you're much more likely to have lost your job or have reduced hours or have no or less income. And those sorts of jobs tend to be held by young people, often by women. And so there's this real risk of long-term scarring. And I think, as Colin said, in some ways, the pandemic is speeding up automation and digitization. And so that's, in a way, going to be a kind of a double whammy of change in the jobs market. So look, the short version of all that is that Southeast Asia is going to need a lot of help from us for quite some time in many different ways, and Australia is responding, but there's more that can be done. And although this is really not my area, but it is the universities, I keep thinking about this and thinking that human capital is going to be really important here. There's a lot of education that's been disrupted. There's a lot of retraining that needs to be done to get people back into jobs, to prepare them for change. Now, finding the right model for that when you're a university is not always straightforward, but RMIT is already doing it, of course, in Vietnam. So there's a big opportunity there, I think.
Oh, thank you. And that's a perfect segue to the first of our audience questions. And Tao, I'm going to get you to take it first. And then, Colin, if you wouldn't mind jumping in on it as well. It starts off with fascinating discussion here. So well done, panel. You're being appreciated so far. It seems that educational needs will evolve differently in different countries across the region. Does that mean, from your perspective, that RMIT should rethink its international strategy, building on what we just heard Richard talk about? Tao, what are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Martin. Thanks for the question. So, whilst I think that there's different countries responding in different ways to COVID and having different stages of their economic journey and so forth, as I said earlier, I do think that there is actually a convergence of some very clear issues and themes that each country is battling with, and this is emerging through my work. And so I think that should RMIT rethink its international strategy? I think fundamental to answering that question is also the reason why we're having this discussion, which is the role of a university. And I think when we look at all the issues that are emerging and that are clearly present, and I had mentioned a few of them before, racial inequality, gender inequality, climate change. We can see things from a symptom level, right? But I think what we need to do is to have radical critical inquiry into what are the structures that are purporting those symptoms. And so the traditional paradigms that we have all been involved in consuming and believing and thinking needs to be disrupted. And a classic example is economics, the teaching of economics. I was a student of economics, and I had studied development economics. And so we are currently still teaching classical economics in terms of what are the things that we value, the four fixed form of capital, and unlimited GDP growth. Now, a radically different view is this idea of donut economics, a regenerative approach, that we have planetary boundaries. And so, I quote Einstein saying that we can't use the same approach to solve the problems that actually got us here to begin with. And so I think in re-examining RMIT's international strategy, I think firstly, there has to be a critical re-examination of your role, which is happening right now, but your role in this concept of regeneration, and that we have to integrate the notion of regeneration as opposed to the notion of extraction, which is how all of our systems have been built on. And secondly, I think RMIT's strategy could also involve drawing out from all of its stakeholders that inner potential to disrupt the way that we're living. And I think finally, the strategy could involve the facilitation of an ecosystem of innovation. You are uniquely positioned, you have global presence, and you're positioned within a very interesting, fascinating, dynamic region. And so you have different stakeholders intersecting with you from all parts of society, from civil society to governments. And I think, there is a unique convening for you in order to facilitate that ecosystem for innovation. And I love, Colin's response by saying the innovation isn't big tech. And I was in a remote province in Vietnam. the little hamlet had just been connected to the grid, and there was a teacher there who was innovating his teaching by actually allowing students to be the teacher, because he said he might be explaining things that the students don't understand. He then got the students each Friday, the really great students, to be the teacher for the day. He then buddied up, different students with each other. So that was innovation. And I can just only imagine how a player like RMIT can actually play that convening role and accelerate the innovation that we really need so that we can live in a regenerative way.
Thank you, Tao. And one of my favorite foods is a donut. So thank you making reference to donut economics. Colin, any thoughts from you about whether RMIT should be rethinking our international strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the short answer is probably yes. One always needs to be sort of retesting and understanding whether the assumptions behind your strategy that you put in place are still correct. And I think the world has shifted a lot. So I think for most institutions, most organizations, there has to be a bit of a rethinking. Not that you end up with different conclusions, but definitely a retesting I think is important, particularly now. And I think in particular, I'd probably think about a few things, right? So the first one, we touched on this before, is sort of the shift of that teaching and learning model. So what are some of the implications of the new platforms that are available and the new broad acceptance of distance learning and sort of that hybrid learning kind of model? And I think for RMIT, there's a lot of opportunities this opens up. Obviously, good strategy is more about deciding what you're not going to do as much as what you are going to do. So the wealth of opportunities within APAC that this opens up, obviously, need to figure out those that are sort of interesting versus those that really there's a unique opportunity to have sort of scaled impact. So I would be looking at the implications of the sort of new kind of education models that are emerging because the acceptance and sort of adoption in the APAC markets has been so fast. A second thing I'd be thinking a lot about is whether or not there are new partnership models that are emerging, whether that's with different types of edtech players, whether that's with different parts of the government. For example, you have some new, pretty innovative, sort of forward-looking ministries of education. You look at the Minister of Education for Indonesia. He's a former founder of the largest tech unicorn in Indonesia. Been really trying to push a lot of transformation in higher ed as well as K through 12 in Indonesia. Are there sort of new broad-based partnerships that really will open up opportunities for greater impact? And then the last thing I would say is, with this shift and the way that education is happening, a lot more sort of digitization, a lot more online components to it, you're also starting to gather a lot of data. So I would also be thinking from a broader strategic perspective about how you can leverage that data for whether it's for standard workflows, making the business more efficient, but also in particular thinking about how you can leverage it to be able to support students in a hybrid environment that oftentimes is more challenging. So how you can identify early on if certain students are starting to disengage and need some additional help, things like that.
Fantastic. Thank you. That was great comments. Got another question, which I think has been on all of our minds. The human connection / engagement between students and teachers is so hard to replicate online. What are your thoughts about how to enhance that, how to make it better? And Richard, you might be surprised, but I'm coming to you first. But you've been doing a lot of this online work over the last 12 months. Have you got any suggestions to the group listening in about how these digital dialogues can be strengthened and made more enriching?
I am surprised you're coming to me, not just first at all. I think you've got two people who are going to answer this question.
It's all right. I'm going to Tao next, but I wanted to get your thoughts.
Well, I've got two thoughts. One is they will never substitute for the dynamism of teaching or engaging in person. So because Canberra's had such a good COVID record. I've had the luxury, particularly over the past couple of months, of getting back and talking to people in person, and there really is no substitute for it. So we should all, I think, while we've learnt that we can do this and it will never go away and it'll be a tool in our armory forevermore, we do need to get back to doing things in person as well. And then the second observation I have is that, having done this almost non-stop for a year, I actually find that, at least for small groups, it can be made to work quite well if you use it often enough so that you get used to the environment. A colleague of mine, Philip Ivanov, who runs Asia Society, I saw him in person last week, and he reminded me that we hadn't seen each other in person for a year. And I was quite surprised by that, because I felt that I'd seen him really nearly every day, but in very small group, very interactive, very intimate type conversations. So the bigger they get, the more hopeless they are. But in small groups, they can be very interactive and intimate.
Yeah, no, thank you. Very good observations. Tal, your thoughts on this one? How can we enrich these dialogues when we can't be face to face?
Yeah, so I answer this question in the context of designing and delivering transformative, inclusive leadership development courses, I guess, for CEO levels across the region. And so I used to do the face-to-face, and of course we can't replace the face-to-face, but I've been able to, I think, from my students, the participants say that the course online has been life-changing for them and created the real inflection points in their life and the way that they live and the way that they lead. And I think, what's really important is two components. The first component is, how are you showing up in the space? And, are your intentions very clear? Do you have a sense of mindfulness and so that you can notice those different things in the students? So I think it's very important for you to come into the space as a teacher to have a sense of real groundedness, real sense of wholeness, and like being very clear about your role as a teacher. And the second thing is in good design, and I think that the virtual classrooms are a component of a journey. So if you design an arc, if you design for an arc of the journey, it's about, setting up the intentions, and then it's having the classes, but also designing for the gaps in between. So the times when they're not seeing you, so how can you help them have a sense of community, perhaps with other students and so forth, rather than just only that experience in the virtual class? And so I think, designing for the whole journey and also for the gaps in between is actually very important. I'm finding that I'm actually having different experiences, like for the people who are traditionally introverts, they're actually welcoming the online space where they can type and put forward some questions instead of, not having the space to ask those questions. So I think, it actually can be something very positive and also very transformational as well.
Yeah, thank you. Look, we've probably got time for one last question, and I'll get you just to be as succinct as you can so I can get to all three of you. There's been a number of questions around RMIT supporting disadvantaged communities in Australia and across the region, and Leighton sort of put them together as one package. But, could we as RMIT be enablers of education in third world countries, and how could we be the leaders in creating affordable education for disadvantaged communities globally? So your thoughts on how we as a university can help the communities that perhaps need us the most. Colin, top of mind thoughts on that one?
I think the answer is yes. I think there's a huge opportunity for supporting these communities, and I think that there's now that sort of technology allows for you to be able to do that at scale. So, there's different types of disadvantaged communities. One area of that we've seen and we've started working in is supporting, for example, refugees. So some of the communities that are kind of locked out of sort of the traditional education systems. And I've seen some good examples of universities also starting to provide really focused, tailored curriculum oriented around getting someone to basically job ready. So some very concrete, specific, say technical training components or other types of areas. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for doing that. There are some platforms, sort of edtech startups that are also operating in this space that can also support universities on that type of journey. But I think it's a place where you can have very significant impact. From what I've seen, the ability to get someone who's disadvantaged from a disadvantaged community from where they are today to a place where they're much more able to get a job is very possible in a reasonable time period. And with the right type of curriculum planning, with the right type of, as Tao was saying, the right type of educational approach to ensure engagement. But I would say, I think there's a huge opportunity there.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. Thoughts from you? How can we help those that maybe need us the most?
Well, yeah, I agree with Colin. There is no end of need and also opportunity out there. And I suppose the only 2 points I'd make, because the university knows its business a lot better than I do, is that this is not a thing you have to do by yourself. There are plenty of organizations and institutions out there that you can partner with that help carry the risk, that help manage programs to which the university can make a contribution. And then the second quick point, because we're running out of time, is you don't have to go to third world countries to find disadvantaged communities. So just to go back to Southeast Asia, my favorite part of the world, most, if not all, well, nearly all of the economies in Southeast Asia are actually middle income economies. Indonesia is $1 trillion economy these days, but there are still millions of people living in disadvantage, millions of people living below the poverty line. So again, plenty of scope to help out.
Thank you. And I think your partnership point is dead on. The work at my last university we did with the UN in refugee camps was a fantastic example of combining, two partner footprints to have a tremendous impact. So Tay, you've got about a minute to have the last word on this one. Well, what are your thoughts?
It's a very hard challenge. Being an ex-lawyer, verbosity is my thing. But look, I think question our assumptions going in first. We have to avoid the idea of we have an understanding and we're going to give our knowledge over. I think it has to be a participatory, co-creative approach. Long have we actually had this neo-colonial approach to a lot of things. Indigenous land management, we've had our way, and it's really disrupted the natural environment. So, I think we definitely have to listen first and go in with a sense of humility before we think that we're solving problems.
And that is probably a wonderful way for us to think about education in almost every setting, Tao, which is if we think about it as co-creation, a shared experience, the role of the educator, to your point before, is to provide the wonderful environment for people to learn and share rather than just simply transmit knowledge or wisdom. So thank you, Tao, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. It is fantastic to have you. To Richard, to Colin, to Tao, we appreciate your time very much. We didn't get through all the questions, so please check out the next.rmit or rmit.next website. You'll see it at the bottom of the screen now. Next.rmit will have the answers to those questions when we go through. To everybody that's tuned in with us today, thank you so very much for being with us. And to the team that are running the Next Strategy Development, terrific job. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.